So welcome to another episode in our series of video and podcasts. Today we welcome Tonita Gonzales, a traditional healer and director of Tonantzin Traditional Healing and Raises Community Education Organization. Today Tonita will discuss the topic of healing generational trauma with ancestral gifts. So she'll share a lot of her many years of work in traditional healing with communities of both Mexico and the U.S. Southwest. So, Tonita, thank you for taking time out of your day to chat with us, and I look forward to hearing your perspective on today's topic of trauma and healing. It's a tough topic a lot of the time, but I think it's really important to discuss, especially how the perspective of traditional medicine. And so here we're talking about psychological trauma in particular, as opposed to physical trauma, but I guess it would include that as well, because it can cause like psychological distress. But traumas are big and small, making a huge impact on our daily living, from when we're young children all the way till old age. And so these adverse experiences, we just don't often expect. They just come out of nowhere, and that's what makes it traumatic. But affecting us all individually as well as collectively in families and whole communities. Which can often result in things like depression, anxiety, even something like substance use. But even like the pandemic or acts of violence towards people of color, have made a big impact on our society today. But I want to begin with your thoughts. But again, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. But how is trauma defined in traditional healing? We can start there.
Well, for me, that's a great and such a loaded and even controversial question. And I'm glad you started this by saying that sometimes it is controversial. So I really can only talk from my experience, not only as a woman of color, Chicana, Latinx. Sometimes we don't know how, there's so many definitions that people take personally and how they call themselves. And I can talk from my experience, but I can also talk from my experience in the past, 20 years working in community as a traditional healer, but also in my community experience before, growing up here in New Mexico, growing up with the experiences with my grandparents and my elders, and understanding racism and generational trauma and what that looks like. I mean, I could think of specifically how impacted. I'm from Gonzales Ranch, New Mexico, which we're proud of our last name of being Gonzales, and how the history of how we got here and my multitude of cultural backgrounds. And I know we talked a bit about it before, but how we're kind of diverse in who we are. And I think specifically about my dad, because my dad came from that generation where we came from a lineage of all of Ramon Gonzales the first, the third, the fourth, the fifth, and then it starts the first, the third. And when it came down to my dad, they called him Ray. And I remember even years ago, probably about 10 years ago, we were sitting and we were talking, and he says, I wish they'd change my name back to Ramon. Right? Because my brother's named Ramon, his son's named Ramon, and they say Ramoncito, and it's all these words. You say Ramoncito in an effort of cariño. But I think in him and in his own perspective, it was a way of like erasing his identity of who he was, of who that lineage is. And even that now in his 70s, that it's something that still pains him when we were being deprived of our culture and our language. And even to the extent where, we know even the next town over in Las Vegas, New Mexico, people that looked like you and I were hung. Right? Or our people that practiced medicine were hung from trees. Or, we know like in one of our elders, her aunt was tied in Cuba, New Mexico to the back of a truck for being an herbalist and drugged through the city of Cuba, New Mexico. And these are our truths. And as much as it's hard to recognize, because we really comes back into, we've had a great experiences. And for me, the reason why we teach medicine, and I hope that the reason and the impact that we've made in community, for me, this is restorative justice. It's not about, sometimes they'll get controversy about what do you pay for? How do you work this? What is the cultural ramifications? But the truth is even our medicine had gone underground because we were afraid. Our ancestors were afraid. So we got denied our health. We got denied our education, our language, our culture. And sometimes when it comes back saying like, this is who I am and this is what I need, people get offended. which that's not our issue. Like, I understand, but they need to stand in their own culture. They need to stand in their own roots. I mean, I think sometimes a statement I make that's a little controversial is that we're all indigenous. And for me, what indigenous means is you came from a culture that was raised with the understanding of the spirituality of the earth. And that goes with all cultures. Everybody in the beginning of time was raised off of plants and medicine and songs and stories, our cuentos, our palabra. Those were all sacred things that came from our way of being. So I think you and I in our same age bracket especially, I think our parents were abused to assimilate. And then all of a sudden in our generation, we're this melting pot, right? We're all assimilated. We all goes into the system where we all look the same, act the same, speak the same. And that was the best way to know. And we know in current research, and you know more than I, how detrimental it is to our physical health, our special health, our mental health, our emotional health, because when we don't have our roots to grasp us into who we are, then we feel like we really don't belong. And then we're outcasts. We're not welcome at the table anymore. And I think that when we allow people to recognize that not only were we in our own culture and sacred, but we were intelligent. We were scientists. Our grandmothers and elders were scientists. And that empowers especially the young people to say, estoy orgullo. I'm proud of who I am, my ancestors, my roots. Some people would say, did you grow up in poverty? To some, yes, but our souls are rich. Our traditions are rich. I mean, we think even now, and I know you're familiar, if we think of the penitentes in northern New Mexico, a lot of people didn't understand the abuse or why they had to practice the way they did. And it all comes down to culture. We grew up in environments now, or the way of healing now, they try to say they look just at the mind or just look at the body. But they don't look at the interconnectedness that we have to each other. What is it about community? What is it about our language and who we are? And when that is ruptured, and now that we start taking it back, it's interesting how the majority of health, they find offensive of that, right? Is this, I think the term they use a lot is like counterculture, or, things like that don't really go against who we are. Cancel culture, yeah. But why aren't we celebrating it? And I think for me, the push of Raices and traditional medicine is, let's celebrate that. And not only that, but that wisdom there that would really add and support our gente's physical and mental and spiritual health. And I say our gente in Spanish, but this is for all cultures, not just for ours.
Yeah, well, I mean, people often respond by like, oh, you're being too sensitive, or, the past is the past, just let it go. And so, but it affects us today, something as simple as a name or a label for a cultural identity, or all the way through acts of physical violence.
And so I think when we acknowledge the problem, then the flip side of that is, how do we give that back to community? And one of the things that I like to focus on are, what are those, when we look at, did our community experience trauma? Yes. What are those gifts? Because the fact that we are alive says that our grandparents, our elders, and our community was resilient. We didn't die, because if all of our culture dies, then we die with it. But the fact that we're alive, what are those gifts that gave us resiliency so that we can move forward? Right.
Well, what does it look like when someone is experiencing trauma, big or small? Like, I know that you've talked about the metaphor of Koyashaki, which I always love. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's in the Mexica tradition, they have the moon. And it's interesting because in the United States, we've always heard the man of the moon, right? Or the cow jumped over the moon. But in so many indigenous cultures, we look at the moon as feminine. And in the Mexica legend it's Coyoshauqui, it's the divine feminine, is the moon. And you'll often hear in indigenous communities, estoy en mi luna, I'm in my moon. That's their menstrual cycle. And a lot of times we don't even honor that sacredness of our body. But in Coyoshauqui, she's basically this broken, fractured woman. And it's kind of beautiful because in the moon, you see it from slivers to wholeness. And when they say she's at her moon, it's like she's at her full peak in glory. So at the same that when we say, when I'm on my moon, it's like, that's the moment. We had an elder, Virginia Garcia here, used to teach prenatal education and prevention along the moon scale, and she would say women are the most blessed things because at the moment of their menstrual cycle, they shed all of those emotions, right, that go with them. That's why they're crying and they're grumpy, but then they get to remember the wholeness of what they are. And I think that Koyoshalki is a great representative of how we work with that adversity, because if we know that we've felt broken, Koyoshalka reminds us we are not broken. We are whole. I mean, the moon doesn't switch shapes. It's always the same shapes, but there's only a sliver that you could see. So if we take that as a great metaphor for, even though sometimes emotionally, even physically, we feel broken, we'll come back to our wholeness, and that's where our generational gifts brings us.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
So related to that is the idea of being wounded, and oftentimes people talk about, you talked about how we feel it emotionally, even in the soul, people talk about the soul wound.
Yeah, it is. I think a lot of times we say, and what some people don't understand is the term that we treat is called susto. And what it means is that you got so frightened that your soul left your body. And so we usually do with like a healing ritual or a ceremony or a plática to bring that person back into their wholeness. So like a simple explanation could be like a car accident. Because sometimes, and interesting, I'm talking about this from a traditional perspective, but if we look at the DSM and behavioral manuals, we would call this PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress. It's like, how did this person disassociate, would be the psychological term, out of their body for our body's own wisdom of separating us so that we don't be in the midst of that trauma. It's like the mental, physical reaction of the body that's healthy. So then how do we, like if somebody were to go to therapy or a spiritual direction, what have you, they want you to bring you back into wholeness. So for us, sometimes it's a ritual of having somebody go to the scene of the accident, and maybe it's, picking up the pieces of glass, let's say it was a windshield. What is it that they need to do to pull themselves into wholeness so that they don't feel trauma? I know for me, it was an experience. My brother suffered a horrible horse accident when he was a baby. And for me, it was literally when one of my teachers, Rita, said, no, you're going to sit here, probably close to me to you, and talk to a horse. And I was like, oh no, because I couldn't come within blocks of horses because I was terrified. But it really had to take me in deep conversation in that silence to really think about what horses do, what their role is in our society. Whereas I was 13 when this happened, and it really up until my late 20s, I wouldn't even communicate with horses. And if somebody were like my niece or somebody want to ride them, I'd be hysterical. It's like, no, they're just not good. But in that sweet time that I had with that horse, I really remembered, especially como soy de rancho, like our family's from the ranch, how much horses aided our family and being able to feed them, like what their role was in society. So it took a whole mind, body, spirit relationship to reconnect that. And so that's what susto is. It's like, even though it was later, I had to go back to re-experience that. Right.
So again, going to that word, like being fragmented or broken, you were separated from our sense of self, or separated from, in this case, our natural relationship with animals, for example.
Right.
And so part of the healing process is to bring that relationship back to whole again.
Yeah. And so part of this conversation that's critical for me is, what are some of those tools we know now, especially in my culture and what has happened? And one of the things that I want to talk about is this corn. This is actually blue corn grown here in New Mexico. It's actually grows all over now, but this is blue corn from here. And for here, my grandmother, whenever I was sick, would grind the corn, and she would make it into, sometimes, this is actually from the Tarahumara region of Chihuahua. This is actually white corn, and this one is toasted with pinole, which is raw sugar in this form, and you make atole out of this. This one's roasted white corn, and this is, when it's roasted, it's pinole. When it's not roasted, it's atole. They both have the same amazing properties. This one has a little bit more properties that it absorbs toxins in the body. And what we know is that in corn, it actually absorbs toxins in the body. So whenever I was sick, my grandmother, I could remember seeing her by my bedroom window walking by, bringing a fresh bowl of atole, because either I had the flu or I had an abdominal sickness. But and even when I went to college back east, I took atole with me. I never made it for myself, but I knew it was like a a sustaining medicine. And I think I had it all 4 years of my college, but never made it. But it was there.
So
it was like a spiritual connection, right? And what was awesome is when I realized later is how much properties the corn had. It strengthened my bones. It absorbed toxins. It gave me calcium. But the part that was really important to me is the spiritual connection. Because when my grandmother was stirring that atole, she's basically putting in her intentions and her prayer. So what we recognize is when we look at corn, that we recognize it as a generational gift. It's something through our ancestors used throughout our lifetime, but we didn't recognize it always as medicine. And maybe some people did, but I think the majority of us didn't. On the contrary, I've heard a lot of people say it's poor man's food. Or I even had a doctor tell my father that corn was used for pigs and not for human consumption. So it's actually, that's absence of culture, right? They didn't recognize it, so they didn't accept it. So when we look at something that's so cultural and precious that every time I look, like when I was it's like a touchstone in psychology where you would say, this brings me back to the identity of who I am. I remember one of my students from Minnesota had a woman, I believe she was Dakota, make this necklace for me. And I love it because it has all the different colors of corn. And I remember my niece when she was like 4 years old, she found it because one of my teachers had lost it in the field, and she's like, "This is the best thing I've ever found." And I explained to her at that time that how beautiful, because traditionally in Mexico there's 7 different colors of corn. What's missing from this is green. And each of them have a little bit of a different property, but they all have the same medicinal use, but they're used ceremonially. They're used differently. And as you know, we use each color in each direction as well. And I think it's important to remember. And one of, I'm sure you remember Juan Carlos, he's one of the curanderos we've worked with from Mexico. And he would say when you use the corn cob, every single corn is different, but yet part of the whole. And yet we assume, but if you look at it under a microscope, every single corn, even though they're all the same color, there's always a variation and they're all different. And I think if we respect that in the identity of ourselves, it's what's precious. And if we look at Brophy, the medicine man from here in New Mexico, from Jemez, he would get the whole kernel of corn and he does a spiritual cleanse and rubs it all over the body. So the fact that it has so many processes, or if you go through a whole nother extreme of, if you went into any of the spas here in New Mexico, they'll get this same ground corn and charge you $300 to rub it on your face as a mask or do a full body mask, where we do that in the Temazcal because of the amount of calcium, how it exfoliates. But it doesn't have to be marketed at $300 for a corn treatment. This is something that we can do. You could grow your own corn. You can do your own process. And so it allows us to connect to our roots.
So not only is it nutritious for our bodies in that type of medicine, but also for like things like stress and, someone dealing with extreme stress or trauma. And so when you incorporate it into that aspect as well. Right.
And spiritually, because we also know, though, is another property of this wonderful corn is that it helps women build breast milk. Right. So if imagine a new mom who maybe she doesn't have her parents around or she doesn't have her grandparents, but she knows that this is a medicine that they used, then it's actually not only nurturing her soul, but nurturing the soul of the baby. So we want to create these connections of medicine and ritual and traditions that we use that facilitate that.
Absolutely. So this is what you mean by ancestral gifts. And I'm curious, like, how are they different or similar to, we treat trauma through these particular therapies or even with pills and that sort of thing. And so,
I brought this with the intention, this rebozo. It's a scarf, and sometimes I would explain that this is kind of like me. Every culture, every identity, it's a variety of how we all are. But if you're in the hospital and you get sick, or if you get lost, or I think even if a traditional story we hear of the Llorona, and there's a part in the sign that says you get wrapped in find your rebozo for safety. And I think this is like one of those examples. So no, this isn't a pill. You're not going to buy this at a pharmacy. But it's something so simple that, and how is it medicine? So if I was working with a pregnant woman and the baby was turned, I can actually do a treatment we call a manteada, or a rebozo. And I can actually, if she was on all four knees, I can move the baby, I can lay her down. If it was an older person, I could, if they threw their shoulder out, I could adjust it to put it back in. Or if their wrist, I could wrap it up if their wrist got dislocated and put it into place. So those are like part of like the medicine part. But if I was really sad, and you think about like our ancestors here in New Mexico, they would do this if they were in mourning, right? Or you would say, never tapate la espalda. It protects your back, especially when you feel like you've had a lot of puñaladas of people, like you didn't feel safety. Something was coming at you. But we also see where you would wrap and hold your baby, right? And it has that mothering where you pull them to the chest. Or you could carry your groceries on your back, right? So there's lots of different ways. So at the time that you feel alone, say you had to go to the hospital, say you had to go get surgery. I remember for me, one of my friends, as part of my spiritual practice, I honor the Virgen de Guadalupe. And when I was going into surgery, a friend of mine said, what do you need? And I said, it's that connection. And when you feel, like for me, it felt like a very sterile operating room, right? And they do it for cleanliness. So what she did is she got these like very thin slip-on socks, and she painted on the bottom the Virgen de Guadalupe. So I wore those socks. It wasn't going to contaminate the room, but it allowed me to know that I was connected. I was connected to my mother, to all of my maternal and paternal motherly connections. But it was something that was able to hold me in a way that nobody else could. And I think every single one of us has those. And for me, when I, even at that point, I was like, what do I tell the surgeons? It's like, yeah, I'm going to go into surgery, but I'm taking my socks with me, right? So we want to be able to have those things in our culture that are indigenous science. They're proven that they work. We have to believe them because it's part of our spirituality of who we are. Because when we understand them, then we understand the faith and the spirituality and the indigenous science of our gente. And then we're not alone.
Right.
Because a lot of trauma isolates us and pushes us on the outside to make us feel alone. So these generational ancestral gifts pull us back together to remember we're not alone.
Right. Well, even something as simple as like the red coral that's used here in New Mexico, or the red bracelets that are given out.
A great example. It's funny. I remember one of our colleagues, Dr. Brenda Pereda, she was saying that she went into surgery and she had to do an emergency. She's the doctor, surgery, and they were doing an emergency C-section. And one of their protocols is to cut all the clothes off. And this young Mexicana woman we wear red bracelets a lot of times for a sign of protection and love and cariño. You're right, it's coral here in New Mexico. In the South, you would use colorín beans. And what that would remind us is that connection, right? Your mother gave it to you that you're always protected, even if you're not with me, or your father or your culture, So when they were cutting off this woman's clothes, she had the red bracelet around her ankle. She says, and I remember screaming, saying, no, don't cut that. She's like, and the nurse freaked out. She's like, but we're supposed to cut everything. And she says, you don't understand, that's a blessing from her grandmother, and she needs it right now more than anything. And I say that because most doctors and most people aren't aware of our culture. So those nurses that were in there may not have been of our culture, but now they know. So the next time they're more conscious to know what can they do to support that environment and create a safety container where people of all colors can come in and practice what they have as their generational gifts.
Right. What keeps them grounded and secure
Correct.
in the time of adversity or trauma and so on.
Yeah, when I talked about the rebosos, when that came to me, it was really when we were seeing a lot of the political adversity that was happening against our Latinos and Hispanos here in the United States. And I said, we're not alone. And I said, get those rebosos when you're on your marchas, when you're out there protesting, so that you remember the strength of all that foundation of where you come from.
Right. It reconnects us even to our ancestors and our elders.
Right.
Okay. So in your experience of working with people, you've done this for many years now. And so what is the outcome once you've, helped them with these ancestral gifts? We talk about balance, for example. What's the opposite side of the fragmentation? How do you know that someone's gotten better?
Well, I think because they make better choices and they don't feel like an outsider anymore. They don't feel as if they don't belong, or as if they're less than. Because I think many times people of culture have been projected as they're less than, or they didn't know. And when you come with this strength, then you're able to sit and say very proudly, "Aira tole," right? Where it's not "Aira tole," the poor man's food. It's "I eat this atole because it makes me strong and it's made my ancestors strong, and I will share it with my children, or I will eat it while I'm breastfeeding because this is what's going to give strength to them, that they have strong bones." And that's actual science. So when we recognize that, the choices that I make when I'm feeding myself, and not just feeding myself with food, but what I drink, what I hear, what I see, I will start to discern and say that does not correlate with my integrity of being, then I'm not going to listen to it. It's a professor, if they're not coming from my sense of culture, that I could say that's their story and what they needed in their life, but this is my story and what I need. And rather than say, how is that different? How is that similar to what I recognize as what the medicine I need? Because I think that a lot of times in our communities, and when people come to you for help, they want to go to that magic person, that somebody that's going to resolve your problems. What we really know is we have to resolve it. So don't give your power away to a doctor, a priest, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a curandero. All of those people should really be, like we have mentioned before, that word doctor actually means teacher. So learn what they're saying, and if it doesn't feel like it resides in your body, then use your voice to say, "Aquí no pasa." You're not coming here. It's not what feels right. Whether it's somebody that gives you an antibiotic and say, "You know, when I take it, I feel nauseous or I get an allergic reaction," don't do it. That has to be with any type of medicine or any type of teaching. If it doesn't resonate in your mind, body, and spirit, find another way.
Right. Earlier you mentioned the word restorative justice. So in this sense, it sounds like you're restoring this sense of personal empowerment to make the decisions for as best as possible for yourself, being part of that process and not being left out.
Right, because it's kind of like I said with the doctor that was speaking to my father that said, you know, corn was just for pigs. So then if you think of that, and my dad was very young when he heard that, what does that mean for the people that are eating corn and that have sustained? And if we look at Mexico, for example, as a country, they have less osteoporosis than any other country in the world because of their amount of consumption of corn. And, you know, and even to some extent their pulque, because it strengthens, it comes out of the maguey, right? So it strengthens their bones. So we need to look as to why is it that, yeah, they have more vitamin D, they're more walking, but their bones are stronger. And here we are where we kind of make the assumption in America, we have the best of everything, we have the best medicine, but yet all of our bones are super fragile compared to other countries. So we were taught that that was better, or that this wasn't consumable. How do we rechange that narrative now?
Right.
That's where we take back that restorative justice to say, you were really doing things, your generations and your culture were doing things correctly from the beginning.
Right. Well, we could go on and on about this topic, and there's, like I said earlier, there's so much to it, and you know, beyond the scope of this talk right now. But yeah, I find it interesting that now, you know, everyone's about trauma-informed care, right? And it sounds like now we need to really focus on how does culture contribute to that idea, as well as things like, you know, how about justice-informed care, you know, in all of this. That includes the cultural, you know, that's kind of like the next step. And traditional healing has a lot to offer then in that regard. And trauma is not just something that happens to an individual, but it can happen to a family or a whole community.
Absolutely.
And so it takes us, you know, being able to come back to our medicine helps us heal as a whole versus just individually.
And it takes conversations and dialogues like this. And I think you and I have taught in community a lot of time is open that dialogue with your grandparents, open that dialogue with your neighbor, with people of your culture, that people that look like you and people that don't look like you. Because then you're able to really say, what is it that I need? And use your voice, because a lot of times what we were taught in our communities, just like if I think of my dad, who I honor and think of a very brave, tough person, but it took him how many years, you know, till he was able to say, I want my name to Ramon to come back. You know, it took a lot of courage for him to say that, and something I didn't think that had really bothered him, but it does every time he looks at his driver's license, right? So how do we give people safe space how does it transform trauma so that we as a community make better decisions to move forward? And that's empowering them back and reminding them how amazing they are and that they have a need to use their voice for themselves.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it comes just in something as simple as being allowed to use your name in whatever language you came in. So
Absolutely.
It just reminds you of driver's license. I have to have a, that exact name and those sort of things. So, but that's the nature of the structures of our society and governments and so on.
And it's changeable.
And
where we were taught it wasn't.
Right.
It is.
Right. Well, I want to thank you once again for sharing all that, your thoughts, perspectives, and wisdom on this. And like I said, we could go on. But we have other series that we'll get into more depths on this. And so thank you once again.